What is the scariest but still unexplained thing that you have experienced? The night before my birthday in 1996, I dreamed that I was walking around near the peak of Everest. It was snowing hard, but I was quite comfortable. There was a tent. To announce my presence, I sang Goober Peas. The two men inside were frightened, and I tried to calm and cheer them. I stayed with them for a while and comforted them. A few years later, I read about the Everest disaster in which mountaineers had to pitch a tent too high on Everest and died there. The night before my birthday in 1996. I can't explain it, but I hope I comforted them. The flight accident that didn't happen to me and several others in the Army. I was flying Hueys for the Army, supporting the Ranger School in the North Georgia mountains in the fall of 1978. At the end of a morning mission, I was on the controls, flying down from the mountains to Camp Frank D. Merrill, LZ, northwest of Dahlonega, GA. I was relaxed, looking forward to refueling and returning to Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, that afternoon. Something started bothering me, and I couldn't quite figure it out. After about a minute, I knew something was badly wrong with the aircraft and that we needed to land. The instruments were all normal. There was no unusual sound or vibration, and the controls handled fine. No binding, sticking, or play. With only about 450 hours of flight time, I alerted the other pilot, a warrant officer with about 3,000 hours of experience, and asked him to take the controls to check things out. I thought I might be imagining things, especially as a trained engineer who couldn't identify any specific issue that would lead to this feeling. He didn't believe me when I said something was wrong with the helicopter. He played around with it for a minute or so, said, "The bird is good," and handed the controls back to me. But as soon as I got back on the controls, that unsettling feeling returned. Something was definitely wrong. I declared an emergency landing and told the other pilot to contact Fort Benning Flight Ops on our UHF radio and give them the coordinates of a small two-helicopter clearing I could see on a gentle slope. "We're putting down right there," I said, and I asked him to contact the Camp Merrill aviation liaison on the local VHF in case anything went wrong during the landing. We landed, and after the rotors stopped, I climbed up top to inspect the rotor hub. The longitudinal bearing that transmitted pitch information to the blades had failed. Instead of having less than a few thousandths of an inch of play, it had over 1/4 inch. The other pilot went pale when I asked him to take a look. A maintenance bird arrived about 5 to 6 hours later with a test pilot and TI. The test pilot took a look, blanched, and asked the other pilot how he knew there was a problem. The other pilot pointed at me and said, "I didn't find it. I thought the bird was good. Lieutenant my last name said the bird was bad and that we needed to land immediately." The test pilot asked me how I knew. I told him the truth. "I have no idea. I just knew we needed to land right away." He didn't believe me, insisting I must have heard, seen, or felt something. The other pilot said, "No, he's telling the truth. I couldn't feel anything either." The crew chief also said he didn't detect anything. The test pilot then said, "You're the luckiest guys alive. You should have been dead already. That bearing should have flown apart. You should have lost the rotor blades, all control of the aircraft, and been a ball of torn metal on the side of the mountain." To this day, I still have no idea why or how I knew something was wrong. It wasn't like a voice in my ear or anything supernatural. It was just a deep, unsettling feeling of something being very wrong, the best way I can describe it. And yes, we both inspected that same bearing during the mission pre-flight. It was completely normal then. Myself, the other pilot, the crew chief, and possibly some of the Ranger cadre we'd ferried should have died that day. But we didn't, and I still can't explain why. Even now. I sat on an armchair, and I felt someone sit up and out of the chair. I was watching a video on the Costa Concordia cruise ship disaster that happened back in like 2012. IIRC, around 30-plus people died during the incident. I get a phone call on a landline phone listed as K Concordia. I pick it up and say hello, and I hear a woman gasp, and then the phone call ends. I thought nothing of it the day it happened, but I later realized how unnerving it was. My father is very religious. He does not believe in ghosts, aliens, anything supernatural, or out of the ordinary. To this day, if this story is brought up, he will quickly find something else to talk about. My dad, younger brother, and I were at my family's hunting camp, sleeping in the small trailer together on bunk beds. It was the day after Christmas, and it was chilly outside, so we went to bed early to wake up for hunting. In the middle of the night, my dad woke up and started screaming like he was being attacked. He then immediately began sobbing. This is the only time I've seen or heard my father cry. When he calmed down, his terrified sons asked what happened. He said he'd had a terrible nightmare about an endless surge of water that was sweeping families away and drowning children. I recall he said those words specifically. To have my dad tell me about a dream was strange in and of itself. You must understand all of this was completely out of character. Finally, I asked if we drowned in his dream because at this point I was sure there was some meaning to this vision. He said no, and that all of the people looked Chinese. Now let me preface by saying we did not have internet access on our cell phones at that time, and we did not have any access to TV or news at our hunting property. Well, this was the morning of December 26, 2004. The very day a massive earthquake struck Asia, which caused a tsunami that took the lives of nearly 228,000 people. I still believe in some kind of collective consciousness because of this event. How could I not? I lived in a small one-bedroom flat under a house, and one day as my cat walked past the bedroom door, she suddenly looked at the wall above my head, froze, fluffed up, and hissed. She started moving to the side really slowly, still fluffed up and staring at that same spot above my head. I looked up, but there was nothing there. When she got near the side of the doorframe, she bolted. I got up to check if she was okay, and as I walked past the TV, it switched off channel to static. My cat wanted out badly, so I took her outside with me. The TV went back to normal, and as I chastised myself for being silly, I opened the door to go back in. But as soon as I took one step inside, the TV went back to static again. I stayed outside with my cat until she calmed down, and nothing like that ever happened again. I still think about it sometimes. It's not quite unexplained. As a kid, I used to sleep with the radio on low because I was afraid of train whistles from the nearby rail yard. As I grew older, this turned into reading books with the light and radio on until I fell asleep. I'm autistic and have always had a messed up sleep schedule, but my parents were fine as long as I did something quiet if I couldn't sleep. One day, I accidentally spilled water on my radio, and it broke in a strange way. It started picking up odd traffic, including radio stations that definitely weren't from my home country. Being too young to fully understand it, I didn't think much of it at first. But then, a strange sound began. It was like someone playing random notes on a keyboard, very slow and eerie. It was super loud, and I started to realize it wasn't a song. It didn't sound like music. It sounded like something I wasn't supposed to hear. My imagination ran wild, and I wondered if it was aliens or something. I woke up my mom, and she was just as baffled. She told me to either try to tune to a different station or turn the radio off. I did, and though I continued to hear weird interference for a few more nights, I never heard that particular sound again. I ended up getting a new radio for Christmas that year. Still, the whole experience stayed in my mind. Fast forward to around 2012, I came across a cracked article about unexplained sounds. I read about something that seemed similar to what I had heard as a kid. It wasn't aliens. It was a Russian number station used for communicating with spies, specifically a type called a slow polytone. Each random note I heard was part of a coded message. Now, I listen for these kinds of signals regularly as a major hobby, and over the years I've gathered a lot of knowledge and journals on the subject. In 1989, I was driving on a familiar rural highway in broad daylight. As I was rounding an easy bend, I was shocked to see a small town appear on the right side of the road, a town I had never seen before. There was a sign that read, St. Vincent. A few things immediately stood out. A shop called Webster Welding, an old-fashioned horse-drawn water pump for firefighting, several large poplar trees with dead tops, and black and white painted rocks lining the street that faced the highway. I kept watching the town in my rearview mirror as I drove away, and it remained visible for a while. A few miles later, I saw a man waving at me from the side of the road next to his broken-down car. He had blown a tire and wrecked his rim, and asked if I could drive him back to the town I had just passed. I agreed, and he got into my truck. But when we drove back to where the town had been, it was gone. In its place was nothing more than a dusty Alberta crossroad. We sat in silence, both of us visibly shaken. At one point, I raised my arm and noticed that the hair on it was standing on end, and he did the same. His hair was standing too. Then he asked, "All the trees were dead? Are we dead?" Eventually, I drove him to a nearby town. He simply got out of the truck and walked away without saying another word. I remember the entire experience as if it happened yesterday. I can still recall every detail of what that mysterious town looked like. That sounds incredibly unsettling. It's one of those moments where reality seems to blur with your surroundings, especially when you're already immersed in something spooky like a horror game. Hearing a voice, especially right after watching something creepy, would definitely send anyone into a panic. And the fact that the sound came from outside your headphones adds an extra layer of eeriness. It's natural to second-guess yourself in these situations, wondering if it was something in the trailer or just your mind playing tricks on you. But the fact that you went back and confirmed the voice wasn't there makes it even more chilling. It's good that you took immediate action and checked things out, though I can imagine how creepy it must have been to investigate the dark hallway with only a flashlight. Leaving the lights on for some reassurance sounds like a smart move, especially after something like that. Sometimes, weird things happen that we can't explain, but hopefully it was just a one-off experience. It's definitely something that would stick with you for a while, though. Thanks for sharing. It really does give you the chills just reading it. That story is definitely chilling. The description of the creature you both saw, glowing eyes, goat-like legs, and the way it stood upright with horns, would freak anyone out, especially at night in a remote area. It's fascinating that both you and your friend saw the same thing and even had the same reaction of feeling that what you were witnessing was just wrong. That eerie instinctual reaction you had, the tears and the way your body froze, speaks to how unsettling and unnatural it must have felt. The fact that you both come from hunting families adds credibility since you would be familiar with the wildlife in the area, making it unlikely that you'd mistake it for a known animal like a moose or bear. Plus, the way you describe the creature's stance, more human-like, heavy set, with horns, definitely doesn't fit the profile of any typical animal you'd encounter, especially with the glowing eyes that high up off the ground. It's also interesting how neither of you reacted in a typical scary movie way. Instead, you were frozen, almost entranced by the sight of this creature. It's as if your bodies knew something was wrong, but didn't know how to react in the moment. That freeze response is often a survival mechanism, and it shows how truly bizarre and terrifying that encounter was. The goat thing. You both saw sounds like it could be out of folklore, maybe resembling something like a cryptid, or even a mythical creature like the Wendigo or satyr. However, it's so strange that both of you saw it so clearly, and yet can't fully explain it. The fact that this happened 12 years ago and still sticks with you says a lot about how deeply it affected you both. Definitely one of those experiences that leaves more questions than answers. Wow. And it's intriguing that no logical explanation quite fits what you saw. When I was a kid in 2003, I had the Nickelodeon Time Blaster alarm clock radio, which I bought from a thrift store. It was so cool but so annoying, and I didn't really listen to the radio much or need an alarm all the time at 10 years old, so I kept it unplugged on my dresser just as decoration. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, it said, "Good night, Jimmy," clear as day, but in that very distinct 90s clock radio sound. It was right beside me too, super unplugged. I wasn't sick or overtired or anything. I've never experienced hearing voices or anything since. Being so young, I tried to pass it off as some cute Jimmy Neutron feature and like some kind of battery malfunction, but they made those clocks in like 1996. It made a lot of annoying sounds, but not like that. And my name isn't Jimmy. So I grew up during the satanic panic of the 80s and was raised in a Baptist home where the devil was hiding around every corner to get you. Stories, some of them true, about pentagrams in newly developed cul-de-sacs and animal sacrifices, children's kidnappings, the white van, etc., were very common. I had a couple of odd experiences growing up that I couldn't explain, but always thought it was my imagination. I am now agnostic, as I believe most religions share the same don't be and jerk teachings about being a good person. I do feel like there is darkness in the world that can't always be explained. In my early 20s, about 20 years ago, there was a gang of us who rented 3 apartments all in the same building, and weekly hangouts were a thing with drinking, smoking weed, and occasional other substances for the party. We all got to know each other really well. And after about a year and a half, we were all chilling upstairs in the top floor apartment. It was midday on a Saturday, and it was too early for getting into the smoking and drinking. We were just chilling, playing some original Nintendo Super Marios and PS1 games. One of the ladies was getting bored and asked if we wanted to play the Ouija board that was on the bookshelf. We all said, "Why not?" and gathered around the coffee table. We played for a while, asking all of the silly questions about what our parents were doing, what their names were, how old they were, etc. One of us asked if the demons were real, and they responded yes. He then asked for them to prove it in a way that we could understand. Suddenly, the entire house shook violently, like an 18-wheeler ran into the side of the building over and over. Bang, 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 bang. It went on for a couple of minutes, and all of us were freaking out. We immediately put everything away and went outside. I have never been as sober as we were in that moment, like reality had been peeled back for the first time. We checked with one of the guys in the bottom floor apartment, and they hadn't heard a thing. I don't know if it was a group delusion or if it was real. I will say I have never touched another Ouija board again. To this day, I can't reconcile my understanding of the world with those events. Before I begin, I should start by clarifying that this isn't 100% my story. It's more of my dad's. Although, according to him, it had something to do with me. This happened back in early January 2020, shortly before the COVID-19 lockdown went into effect. It was late one night, and I was asleep in my bed as per usual, much like the rest of my family. Or so I thought. I awoke to the sound of my bedroom door opening, followed by footsteps approaching my bedside. I glanced over to see my dad cautiously entering my room. I could tell it was him because I had a nightlight that allowed me to make out the details of his silhouette. I didn't let him know I was awake and that I could see him, though. He leaned over my bed, tilting his head toward me as I lay there in confusion for a few seconds before he got up and left, closing the door behind him as if nothing happened. Eventually, I fell back asleep after dismissing the whole thing. Cue the next morning as I go downstairs to join my family for breakfast. Everything went as normal until my mom told me and my older sister to take a seat in the living room, as there was something my dad wanted to talk to us about. Confused, we both complied and did exactly that. My sister and I sat on the sofa, and our parents sat opposite from us. It wasn't long before my dad began speaking, sounding absolutely dumbfounded as he did. He explained that last night he awoke to the sound of someone entering the bedroom he shared with my mom. He expected it to be either me, my sister, or one of our 2 dogs, but it wasn't. Standing over him and reaching out one of its hands was what he described as a translucent white silhouette that was mist-like in texture. That wasn't all, however, as he went on to say something about it that has stuck with me in the 4 years since, which was that this figure, whatever it was, had a nearly identical height and build to mine at the time. My dad continued, telling us that when he looked at it, it seemed startled and suddenly recoiled before it turned around and walked back to the doorway, collapsing in on itself and vanishing without a trace. He then claimed that after sitting there in shock for a few seconds, he quickly got up to check on me, as he feared the worst after noticing the being's aforementioned resemblance to me, which is what led to me seeing him come into my room the night before. We've never told this to anyone we know in person, except for my aunt, uncle, and cousins from my mother's side of the family when we visited them a few months later, Nothing like it has ever happened before or since, and no one else has lived in our house except for us. None of us can come up with any sort of rational explanation for it, and my dad says he will go to his grave swearing he wasn't dreaming. I've posted about this before, but about 6 years ago, my fiancé and I were driving home. It was a 5-hour drive, and we were just about home. It was October, so it was pretty cold out, 9 p.m., and it was raining. This stretch of road is in the middle of the woods, and there are no lights out there, just dark woods. We were in the middle of a conversation when we both went silent at the same time. We both saw something on the side of the road, peering out of the woods. We drove down that road often, so we have a pretty good idea of the scale of this thing. It was around 7 or 8 feet tall, completely hairless, humanoid, and white. It looked completely emaciated, and its arm and hand were extremely long and skinny. It peered out and looked at us, illuminated by our headlights. We just sat there silently after we passed it. I eventually asked, "Did you see?" And my fiancé interrupted, "Oh, thank God you saw it too." A few days later, we were hanging out with a couple of friends who lived nearby. We hadn't told them about what we saw, but they ended up telling us that they saw something nearby. When they saw it, it was at a distance, at the opposite end of a recently harvested cornfield. They said it galloped on all fours, almost like a baboon, completely hairless, nude, emaciated, and impossibly tall and lanky. Several years passed, and I made a post on Facebook about it. Another friend messaged me, saying her mom and sister saw one on the side of a road on the outskirts of this same town. I did some research and found that about 20 minutes away, someone described seeing the same thing and posted about it online. Apparently, they're seen fairly often, and people have started calling them crawlers. And it sucks because I can't expect anyone to believe it. If someone came to me and said all of this, I probably wouldn't believe it. But we saw it clear as day. In fact, my fiancé grew up in a house in the woods outside this town, and he thinks he saw one when he was a kid. I believe him because one time we camped outside that house when nobody was living there. In the woods, we heard a baby crying. There's no way a baby would be in those woods. I used to work for a swimming pool company and was renovating an in-ground pool for a customer. It was a young family with kids in a fairly wealthy neighborhood. The pool had been empty and covered for some time. I took off the cover and found a middle-aged man living in the shallow end. He looked extremely scary and disturbing and smelled terrible. He immediately ran away, barking as he went. I knocked on the door and let the man of the house know. He called the cops. The creepy thing was that the man in the pool had several belongings, including children's underwear stuffed in a pillowcase that he was using, along with various items from the house. There were rotisserie chicken carcasses everywhere. They had noticed things missing, so he must have been going in and out of the house all the time. He had quite the treasure trove. Another weird thing was that they had a lot of windows in the back of the house with no curtains, so he could probably see everything they were doing. They thought the smell was just stagnant water in the pool. I knew one of the cops that responded and kept in touch. They never identified the guy. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more Behind the Veil.